Hey, now, when I was a kid, we used to watch something called Scooby-Doo. And at the end of Scooby-Doo, they would take the mask off the villain and see who it really was who was causing all that trouble. And usually he would say something like, "If it weren't for you meddling kids, I would have got away with it." And they're surprised. A gasp would come out. Surprised, "Mr. Jones, how could it be you?" they would say. Well, today we're going to do a little bit of unmasking. So it's called the Article 5 Convention Lobby Unmasked. I'll start with a quotation from someone that we should be aware of. His name is Patrick Henry. Back when the U.S. Constitution was being debated for ratification in the state of Virginia, he said something very insightful. He said, "Guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel." So today we're going to talk about some people that want to approach the public liberty, as we call it, the U.S. Constitution. And well, the advice from Patrick Henry was, boy, we should be pretty cautious about that. Didn't say we should never change the Constitution, but we should guard with jealous attention the public liberty. These are things that are very consequential changes. So we're going to suspect everyone who approaches that very valuable thing, the U.S. Constitution, because we inherited something that is very valuable, very unique in the history of the world. Okay, to give an overview of what we're talking about today, just for those who may not be aware. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, there's 7 articles to the original Constitution. The 5th article talks about how to make changes or amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And basically, there's 2 routes for proposing amendments, and then there's 2 possible ways for ratifying or making those amendments or changes part of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the way we've always done it in our 230-some year history of the U.S. Constitution is that 2/3 of both houses of Congress would propose an amendment. And if both 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the U.S. Senate would pass, though that proposed amendment would go to the states for ratification. Now, we have amended the U.S. Constitution 27 times. In every case except for one, the ratification has been done by state legislatures. In one case, it was done by special ratifying conventions in each state outside of the state legislatures. There's a way that's never been done, though, for proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and that's through 2/3 of the state legislatures passing a formal resolution, generally is how it is, a request, an application, asking Congress to call a convention for proposing amendments. And the convention itself would then propose amendments, and they would be sent to either the state legislatures or to special ratifying conventions in each state for ratification to decide whether they become part of the U.S. Constitution. And that's what we're talking about today. Often this is called a constitutional convention, a con, an amendments convention, a convention of states. There's various names for it, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But if you look at Article 5, it's very brief, and you notice that there are some key questions on how that would work that are left unanswered, and those have been throughout history the subject of much heated debate as to what would actually happen if we had a convention. And these are questions of not small consequence. Who would be the delegates? How many would there be? How many votes would each state get? Would the convention be limited in scope, or would it have any boundaries whatsoever? Over the years, Congress has kind of filled in the blanks as to where the Constitution is silent on these issues. One of them is whether or not, 2/3 of the states, meaning 34 out of 50, would have to apply for a convention for the same subject, or would it just be 2/3 of the states applying for anything? Up until this point in history, Congress has decided that they won't actually call a convention until 2/3 of the states request a convention with the same type of subject matter being considered in mind. All right. Now we're going to go into how some of the people that are proposing, pushing for a convention for proposing amendments, try to convince state legislators especially, but also the average person, that this is a good idea. I'm going to focus today on 4 main tactics that they use. The first one is what I call altering the deal. Basically, that means that they put forward a set of, you might say, parameters or rules that they assure people that will be followed leading up to and during a convention and after. And then somewhere down the line, they say, you know what, actually, we're going to change our marketing on that. Second, false marketing tactics. So various ones, false claims, assurances, all kinds of things like that. And then one of the things they actually try to do is eliminate the opposition. They don't really like people standing up and saying, wait a second, I have a question about this. They want to silence them and get rid of them. And then the last one, we'll look at uniting the left and the right in politics to change the Constitution. So let's start with the first one, altering the deal. Well, let's start by basically going into the marketing that is generally done toward conservatives, but sometimes the convention idea is marketed towards liberals, progressives, all that. But for the conservatives, they basically say, hey, we have an all out of control federal government. The federal power is far in excess of what the founders intended. They give various examples, the Supreme Court making terrible decisions, executive orders, maybe it's Congress that's doing something that's just totally unconstitutional. And they say, you know what we need to do to correct this is to amend the US Constitution. And we need to do it in a way that's never been done before. We need to call a constitutional convention. But of course, they have various names for it throughout history. We'll get into that. But they'll say something like, well, we've studied this out, so you can trust us. We're the experts. And actually, a convention is the only way that this was done. In fact, the founders designed the Article 5 convention process for situations just like this, so we can rein in a tyrannical federal government. Well, the conservatives, that sounds really good. And they often decide that, well, not hearing anything to the contrary, we ought to get on board with this thing so we can right the ship. This sounds like a really good plan for reining in the federal government. Now, you might wonder, what about the liberals? What are they trying to get out of this? Well, it's basically the same marketing pitch to the liberals, but they touch on types of amendments that might come out of a convention that would be appealing to the liberals. So for the conservatives, they say, hey, we could get a balanced budget amendment out of this. We could get a term limits amendment out of this. We could get on and on. For the liberals, it's campaign finance reform. We need to get corruption out of politics, and money is the corrupting influence in politics. And so we can amend the Constitution to do that. Okay. Well, they always say that there will not be a runaway convention, that the convention would stick to what just the things that you want to see changed in the Constitution. It wouldn't go off on something that was somebody else wanted. Of course, it could be limited, and that you would have the power to effectively limit it. That the way to do that is have the applications be the same wording, and then they'll make various claims such as this. Here is one of the people that on the conservative side, usually the Republican side, that they're trying to appeal to, the Article 5 convention lobby. They hold up this gentleman here. His name is Robert Nadelson. He's an academic, and he's kind of over the years established himself as a reputation of being the expert on a convention for proposing amendments to the US Constitution. So back in 2013, here's what he was saying to state legislators at a meeting of the American Legislative Exchange Council. Here you go.
There are far, far more controls over this convention than there are over the runaway Congress. For example, when the states offer 34 applications on any one particular subject, the convention is limited to the scope of those applications.
Okay, so that sounds pretty good. You just have the same wording or the same subject to make it very clear to Congress that this convention should be limited in its agenda so far as proposing amendments. Then, hey, there's nothing to worry about, right? It won't go off the rails. That's the way to do it. And many legislators believed that. And so going back to, for example, in the 1970s, there were quite a few states. It got up to actually in 1982, there were 32 states out of the needed 34 to trigger a convention for proposing a balanced budget amendment. So all these states, they passed these applications to Congress for a convention. And one of them was Utah, for example. Here's their language they use. The Utah legislature applies to the Congress of the United States to call a constitutional convention to propose a balanced budget amendment. That was back in 1979. And pretty much every other state used the term constitutional convention at the time. And they wanted a balanced budget amendment. But then in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, state legislators looked back on that and they looked into what the Constitution actually says so far as limiting a convention, and they found out, hey, there's really nothing in there that would limit the scope of a convention in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. So many states, including Utah back in 2001, and this was unanimously in Utah, they rescinded all their previous applications for a constitutional convention, including the one for a balanced budget amendment. So here's what language they used in Utah in 2001. Be it resolved by the legislature of the state of Utah that any and all existing applications for a constitutional convention heretofore made by the legislature of the state of Utah for any purpose, whether limited or general, be hereby repealed, rescinded, and canceled, as if the applications had never been made. Basically, the legislatures of Utah and many other states woke up to the fact that, wow, we really just don't want to put the whole Constitution on the table for revision. We might want to change one or two things, but very few legislators would stand up and say, yeah, we need to renegotiate the Constitution. So here's what they looked at, by the way. You might have a question as well. You might not be as familiar as others on what Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution says. Well, here's what it says. Okay. The Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, in other words, when they receive a formal application from 2/3 or more of the state legislatures, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So right there, it's a convention for proposing amendments, plural. It doesn't say they can be limited, other than there actually are two things that cannot be amended in the U.S. Constitution, according to the Constitution. Provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article. That has to do with slavery. Obviously, 1808 is long past. And that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Now, arguably, many say that that was violated, that provision was violated with the 17th Amendment, where the state legislatures lost their ability to choose the U.S. senators. Not every state legislature ratified that amendment. So other than that, there's nothing else that cannot be changed in the U.S. Constitution through the convention proposal process or the congressional proposal process of amendments. Either way, that's it. So Some ask, well, are we comfortable with everything else being on the table? I'm not. All right. So after some of the rescissions went on, the people pushing for a convention, they kind of regrouped and said, well, things aren't going our way so well. So they decided that, for example, after Utah rescinded its application for a constitutional convention, it's all its previous applications, they said, no, actually, we're not pushing for a constitutional convention. We're pushing for a convention of the states. Very different. Okay. So a group came forward called the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force. One of their front men was a man named Bill Fruth, wrote a book. In there, he said, a convention for proposing amendments is not a constitutional convention and never should be called such. There is no provision in our Constitution for such an assembly. And many state legislators thought, oh, well, that's great. I don't want to put the whole Constitution on the table. We'll feel comfortable applying for a convention of states. It's kind of like calling prunes dried plums, but it worked. It was a clever rebranding of what they were trying to sell. Now, really the way to sort this out, and I have many people ask me this, is it a constitutional convention? Is it a convention of the states? Is there a difference in the power? Well, all of these applications say in them, pursuant to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, we apply to Congress for a convention for proposing amendments, etc. Whether they call it a Article 5 Constitutional Convention, an Article 5 Convention of States, Article 5 Amendments Convention, does not matter, because what matters is where the authority comes from and the limits of that authority, which are defined in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. And Black's Law Dictionary would certainly agree with that. It defines a constitutional convention as a duly constituted assembly of delegates or representatives of the people of a state or nation for the purpose of framing, revising, or amending its constitution. Now, as if it were not clear enough, it goes on to say Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution provides that a constitutional convention may be called on application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. Now, sometimes I run into people who are so convinced that it's not a constitutional convention. They'll come and say, you know what, I trust Robert Nadelson. I trust Mark Meckler. I trust Mark Levin on this one. Who are you to tell me otherwise? All right, well, if you trust Mark Meckler, here you go. He's talking to a group of legislators at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Here he is.
If you stand up and put your career on the line to support a call for a constitutional convention, you need to know that there's an army behind you.
All right, so even Mark Meckler calls it a constitutional convention. Of course, if you go to anybody nowadays, including Mark Meckler, say, no, we want a convention of the states. Well, of course, he knows there's no difference. All right. Well, so this was a situation back in 2015 through 2021. Basically, the people pushing for an Article 5 convention for a balanced budget amendment weren't getting anywhere. They had states apply, but other states rescinded. And they decided that they were going to go to states like Utah and try to get them to reapply. And so here's the language from Utah, for example. Be it resolved that the legislature of the state of Utah, by this resolution and under the provisions of Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, applies to Congress for calling of a convention of the states to propose a balanced budget amendment. So basically all they did is they switched out the term constitutional convention with convention of states from between 1979 and 2015. All right. Now, people that are pushing for a convention, they said, oh, we got to change up things if we're going to trigger a convention. So what are we going to do? They actually let it be known publicly, although in a lesser known blog online, their strategy. And here's some highlights from it. They said, the comprehensive strategy of ACF, the American Constitution Foundation, needs to be seriously considered and funded in planning to make application to the Congress to call a general COS, in other words, an unlimited convention for proposing amendments. So I say, we should come out openly in favor of a convention for that's unlimited. Wow. And who was the ACF, the American Constitution Foundation? In a nutshell, their goal from their website to facilitate the first ever Article 5 General Convention in American history. In other words, they want to put the whole Constitution on the table for renegotiation. If that doesn't sound alarming, let's take a look at more of their strategy. They said, in concert with the axiom, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, it makes good sense to use whatever qualifying COS applications are available to have a COS convened as soon as possible. In other words, throw anything at the wall, see what sticks, and see if we can convince Congress to call a convention. We'll get into that more a little bit later, but they also said they should work with additional states if necessary to remove limiting language from an existing application for a convention, or pass a new application for an Article 5 General Convention to attain the necessary 34 applications to trigger the convention. So in other words, let's get states to apply for a more broad convention, and then we could push for a convention and say that we have the 34 states needed. Finally, they said Convention of States project, COSP applications are the closest to a general application. In other words, they wanted to push for an unlimited convention for change in the US Constitution in a stealth way, something that's marketed as limited, but in practice would be unlimited. And that, for that purpose, the Convention of States project applications fit the bill pretty well for that strategy. All right. Now, here's Robert Nadelson again. Now, this is just 5 years later. Here he is, 2018. And he says, the problem here, why we're not triggering a convention, is Congress needs to count the applications correctly. So he wrote an article, an academic article in the Federalist. He said, when counting applications toward a convention for proposing a balanced budget amendment, or indeed toward a convention for proposing any other kind of amendment, Congress should add to the count any extant plenary applications. In other words, he's saying that, well, if there's an application for a convention that is unlimited, just as we want a convention, we should tack that on, and Congress should count that towards having a convention for a balanced budget amendment. Now, the question that is raised there, of course, is, well, if you lump in things with different subject matter, what will be the limitations on the agenda of that convention? Hard to say that it would be just a balanced budget amendment, but some might argue that. But here's another sign that might alert people to what they're trying to do to alter the deal. One person that was part of the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, which later renamed itself to being called the Let Us Vote for a BBA, Balanced Budget Amendment, was David Biddulph. He was going around to various state legislatures. South Dakota, met him there, probably came to Utah. But he said, one state should pass one resolution that says, here are 34 Article 5 applications, 28 on a single subject, and 6 on any subject, and we're going to demand that Congress call the convention. So if, asking nicely didn't work, they're going to say, we've reached the 34 state threshold and we're going to actually sue Congress to call a convention. Now, there was some problem with that because actually in 2022, David Biddulph and others, the same group, they came to the Utah legislature and they said, you know what? Back in 1979, we did some research, and actually we reached the 34 state threshold a long time ago, 43 years ago. And so what we should do is lump in the balanced budget amendment applications for a convention with others that are unlimited in scope. All right, well, there's a problem with that. Let's take a look at the language from the 2015 resolution application from Utah. It says, the legislature of the state of Utah respectfully requests that this application be considered as covering the same subject matter as the presently outstanding balanced budget applications from other states, and that it should not be aggregated with any applications on any other subject. But the resolution in 2022 that was introduced this year, it made the claim that, well, in 1979, Nevada passed this resolution asking for a convention for a balanced budget amendment. And then it says, combined with the Article 5 applications for a convention of states on any subject, the Nevada Article 5 application was the 34th application. Okay, but Utah specifically requested that its application from 2015 not be aggregated or added up with applications on any other subject. So there's a problem there, isn't there? But probably the bigger issue is that this group that's pushing for a convention ostensibly for a balanced budget amendment is coming out in the open and saying, we're okay with this being such a convention being open to other ideas. And by the way, there's some false marketing here. They admit that the balanced budget amendment they envision now would not actually decrease spending. It would slow the increase in spending, and that they demand it be ratification by a vote of the people, and that Social Security would be exempt from a balanced budget, and that it would not require budgets to balance annually. So on 4 counts, you might argue they're going back on their assurances that this would actually be fiscally conservative, reducing government, something actually meaningfully reducing the size of government. Now, just to touch on, why does this group insist that ratification be by the people? Well, they know history. And if you look at history of how we got our current constitution, there was a concern that the instructions to the delegates of the 1787 convention were going outside their authority. But James Madison, who's father of a U.S. Constitution, he said the people were in fact the fountain of all power, and by resorting to them, all difficulties were got over. They could alter constitutions as they pleased. So in other words, if somebody would raise the objection that, hey, this is going beyond our instructions from our state legislators, they could always come back and say, well, it's ratified by the people in the states, and therefore it's legitimate. So there you go. But here is the model resolution from the Let Us Vote for a BBA. This application is to be considered as covering the same subject matter as the presently outstanding balanced budget amendment and limited subject applications from other states, including but not limited to previously adopted it, and applications from and then the list of states. Well, okay, the only way to have the scope of the application be both for a balanced budget amendment and unlimited subject applications is for the convention to be unlimited in subject matter. So they're coming out and saying that this is an application for an unlimited convention. There's only one way to do that. It's and, not or. Okay. Now, one final false marketing tactic, they say, false but flattering assurances. Hey, the states would never ratify anything stupid. Well, actually, if you go back to the 16th income tax, 17th direct election of US senators, those were both ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. 38, actually more than 38 states ratified those amendments. So there were very few states which said no. So there are 2 examples right there in South Dakota. it was unanimously adopted in both House and Senate. Both 16th and 17th Amendments were ratified there.
Worst case.
All right. Now, there's also false marketing going on. But there's at times there are frank admissions, you might say. And so we can look at the Staff Counsel for Convention of States, Robert Kelly, back in 2014. He said, our application is fairly broad. My opponent's argument against this is that it opens up all the articles. And then he finally says, and that's true. Wow. Okay, so he admits that the Convention of States application puts the whole Constitution on the table. Then he kind of hedged a bit and said, except for Articles 6 and 7, but basically it was an admission that this was for an open general convention. Well, this subject came up again when Mark Meckler, who is CEO, co-founder of Convention of States Project, went to South Dakota for the Freedom Fest in Rapid City. And he was asked by an audience member, let's listen to it.
So if there's no risk, then why did you put limitations on the enabling and educate the three basic limitations in the laws that you're?
So as opposed to doing a general convention.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so the three basic limitations that we're talking about, if you're not familiar with Convention of States Project model resolutions: fiscal restraints on the federal government, limitations on the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and term limits on Congress and federal officials. So why did you put those three in there if really there's no risk of this convention going off the rails? So here's Mark Meckler's answer. Very interesting.
So the reason is for narrative. In other words, if I were to say, if we were to put out there to the world that, hey, we're just gonna have a convention, we have no idea what we're gonna talk about at this convention, then frankly, nobody would support it because there'd be so much fear out there. Everybody would be afraid that we had to frame it in a way. I mean, this is one of the things that I think, I'm just gonna say this generally, libertarians and conservatives are really bad at narrative. We just generally don't understand narrative. And if you don't frame a political discussion in the correct way, you lose.
Okay, so these are two key marketing concepts that all of us should be aware of, and they apply to political discussions as well. Narrative is a story that you tell your audience to try to get them to buy into what you're trying to persuade them to do or to buy into or to buy, right? Now, it can be connected with reality, or it could be disconnected from reality. But the main thing is you need a compelling narrative to compel them to the action you want them to take. Framing is kind of a figuratively putting barriers around, or a box around, the terms under which you consider a political discussion or a controversy. And if you can successfully do that, you've basically won the argument. If you don't successfully do that, like Mark Meckler points out, you lose. All right. So framing, there has to be so much effort put into that so that you have the advantage in the political discussion. All right. Here's another example of false marketing admissions. Back in 2013, when Convention of States Project was just getting off the ground, co-founder Michael Ferris made this admission about Supreme Court.
If they abuse it, we just keep calling it. So if the Supreme Court messes up, okay, let's abolish it. You know, if they're going to ignore the Constitution, we abolish the Supreme Court and figure out some other way to settle these disputes.
Now, abolishing the Supreme Court might sound appealing from time to time. However, the larger thing I think that this points out is that the co-founder of the Convention of States Project is admitting that essentially rescinding or repealing the entire third article of the U.S. Constitution, one of the 7 original articles, is well within the Convention of States Project language for the agenda of a convention. interesting. Then it kind of raises the question of what would not be within the purview of such a convention under that language. So here's another admission. So somebody asked, hey, there's always this question, we can amend the Constitution. How do we ensure that these new amendments be followed? Here's what Michael Ferris says.
The greatest thing that we can achieve out of a convention is if they mess it up again, we call another convention.
Okay, that sounds kind of weird. I mean, the hammer didn't work the first time, so just hit it harder with a sledgehammer. I mean, basically, the admission here is that the goal of having a convention is not to change the Constitution in a way that would be beneficial, really, or in a small way, but simply to open up a new avenue for perpetually changing the supreme law of the land in ways that are really unlimited, as we saw in the last slide. That, to me, is pretty unsettling. I don't know for you, but okay. So Mark Meckler, here he emphasizes the importance of a compelling narrative and what he calls shoveling. Here's an interesting quote from Alec.
If we want to inspire the grassroots to engagement, our primary purpose has to be to tell a story that will engage them. This is probably the only thing I'm an expert on. That and shoveling stall, I'm pretty good at that. That comes in handy with shoveling, comes in handy in politics as well.
Always good to throw a little humor in there, but was he serious or joking at that? Shoveling, nice euphemistic way of saying deception, I think, for Mark Meckler. But let's take a look at some of that expert shoveling that Mark Meckler puts forward. All right, here is Mark Meckler in Pennsylvania before a committee. He makes an interesting claim right here.
Every single nationally known conservative, law professor, talker, politician who has taken a position nationally known on the Convention of States is in favor. There are no exceptions. Rush Limbaugh, God rest his soul, Levin, Hannity, Beck, Shapiro, all the professors I named on our legal advisory board, there are no exceptions.
Wow, there are no exceptions. I mean, there's no opposition on the right to what Mark Meckler wants. That sounds like you're in the minority if you oppose him, right? Except that was a kind of a pants on fire type of claim. Here are conservative. Here's one person, Andy Biggs. He's been the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. He wrote a whole book on what he calls the con of the con. Now, actually, the originator of the term con was a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, who was instrumental in defeating the Equal Rights Amendment. She was head of the Eagle Forum for many years. Here's Ron Paul, presidential candidate to probably one of the most constitutional, freedom-minded members of Congress and three-time presidential candidate. Here is Antonin Scalia from the Associate Justice Supreme Court. Here is, of course, nationally known again, Barry Goldwater. So many people have opposed the convention from the right, nationally known. So just not true. Here's another claim by Mark Meckler, just using semantics. He says, we're not working to change the Constitution, we're working to restore the Constitution. Now, the second part you might argue back and forth, but the first one is blatantly false. Now, I don't think Mark Meckler is a stupid person. He certainly knows the definition of amending or amendment, and he knows that is to change a law or constitution. So to say that, and of course, their movement is to change the U.S. Constitution. That's what they want to do. All right, here is another thing. Hold up a phony conservative.
The number of lawyers on our legal advisory board and their stature in the legal community is second to none. Professor Robbie George at Princeton, who's considered the foremost conservative constitutional scholar in America, is on our legal advisory board.
Wow, Robbie George is on the legal advisory board. I wonder what Robbie George is like. Well, here we go. Robbie George just happens to be the co-author of what's called the Conservative Constitution as a replacement to the current Constitution. And now, if if you're wondering, usually conservative is defined by as a reluctance to change things. Eagerness to change the US Constitution and replace it with something different would be the opposite of conservative. And by the way, he's a member of the Deep State Council on Foreign Relations. He holds the endowed professorship chair in the Princeton University, which was originally held, that chair was originally held by somebody known as Woodrow Wilson. He's not really well known as a conservative. I'm sure you're aware of that. Getting into some of the highlights or lowlights of this proposed new constitution, it guts the Second Amendment and moves us toward a national popular vote to abolish the Electoral College. He happens to be a never Trumper, not exactly a traditional conservative. And just in case you're wondering, when I say gut the US Constitution, Second Amendment, here's what it actually says. Neither the states nor the United States shall make or enforce any law infringing the right to keep and bear arms of the sort ordinarily used for self-defense and recreational purposes, provided that states and the United States in places subject to its general regulatory authority may enact and enforce reasonable regulations on the bearing of arms and the keeping of arms by persons determined with due process to be dangerous to themselves and others. In other words, you only have the right to keep and bear arms if the government says you do. That's supposedly the foremost conservative constitutional scholar in America on the legal advisory board of the Convention of States. Okay, then you've got this attack on, you can imagine, the John Birch Society just happens to be one of the kind of the adversaries of the Convention of States project. Here's Mark Meckler making a smear of the John Birch Society. Wow, thanks.
It's also important to know the origin of those arguments. They come from an organization called the John Birch Society. Decades ago, chased from reasonable political discourse for issues of racism and anti-Semitism. So I think those arguments are long discredited, and especially before this legislature.
Okay, so this is a logical fallacy tactic called poisoning the well. Don't listen to these guys that are about to talk in opposition to what I just told you, because they were accused of something nefarious in the past, and therefore, whatever they have to say on this unrelated subject, they don't have any authority to speak on it. That's basically the argument. Of course, it's a logical fallacy. But the other side of that is it's actually false that they were, the John Birch Society was proven to be racist and anti-Semitic. Actually, the opposite. Now, they were accused of being racist, anti-Semitic. There was, in California, the state Senate did a fact-finding investigation. Actually, they went secretly to visit chapters of the John Birch Society in California back in the early 60s. They published a 60-plus page report, which you can look up online. And the long and short of it was this. The society has been publicly charged with being a secret, fascist, subversive, un-American, anti-Semitic organization. We have not found any of these accusations to be supported by the evidence. Of course, the media didn't say, oh, boy, we were wrong about the John Birch Society. They just went on and continued to make similar claims for years and years. But the people that actually looked into it and wanted to, they found out the truth. All right. Now, a fourth tactic of the people pushing for a convention is to simply silence, eliminate, defeat their opposition. This year, they took it to a whole new level. In South Dakota, they're having a real difficulty getting their application passed, and it's because of several state legislators. They decided to target, during the primary elections, the Republican primary, 4 state legislators that are running for state Senate. They spent nearly $350,000 on polling, radio ads, cable TV ads, postcards, digital ads, and funding opposition candidates, or at least funding marketing favoring those opposition candidates. They barely defeated one, and now they've got some people that they'll be back in the legislature, most likely, that'll be extra motivated to oppose the Convention of States project. They put up postcards like this that had didn't talk about amending the Constitution at all. Whether they're true or not, their claims, I don't know. But the address on there, it's a little hard to see that, but the mailing address was from this location right here. 3 blocks, literally 3 blocks away from the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This is from an organization that claims that we're going to drain the swamp, that we're going to rein in the federal government, that we're going to bypass Congress, and that we're going to empower the state legislatures. There you go. All right. Now, this particular state legislator, state senator in South Dakota, they don't really like him. He's kind of their enemy number one, okay? And here's what he said about Convention of States in a committee hearing.
This Convention of States has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on PR. This is dark money. It's based out of Texas, California, Indiana. It is not from South Dakota. Take a look at South Dakota Secretary of State's records if you want to see how much money has been generated from the state of South Dakota. $3,000 in the last 10 years.
Well, that sounds like an organization that's flush with cash for coming from out of state. Mark Meckler was actually there at this committee hearing. He gave a rather different picture of their organization. Take a look at this.
We've heard a lot of things from the opponents, a lot of alleged facts and allegations and frankly smears, dark money, you know, dangerous people. I just want to give you a little background on the organization. I founded the organization myself. It operates out of a big fancy office building located in the middle of my house outside of Austin, Texas. The money is raised by my wife, Patty, who is our only development director.
Wow, it sounds like it's just a very grassroots organization, just taking little donations and all that. Well, fortunately, we have some IRS forms that are from Convention of States. And what do we find? Convention of States action. We don't get the names of their donors, but we do get a little summary. Over a 3-year period, they brought in $18.8 million in contributions. 54% of those were from major donors, defined as $5,000 or more in a donation. The average major donation, assuming each one gave only once, which is not terribly likely, was over $81,000. And by the way, the Meckler family, Mark, Patty, and their son, took in approximately 7% of that total over the 3 years for over $1.3 million in their to their family. So needless to say, they're not running this out of their basement, their garage, or their living room. And it's an organization that is funded mostly by major donors who have no trouble reaching in their pocket, pulling out it and writing a check for upwards of $100,000. That's the fact of the matter. So we're talking about big money, and the question of course is, why is big money trying to change the Constitution? What do they want out of their as a return on their investment? I don't know the answer to that, but we can speculate as to that to no end. But by the way, this right here is the office building, fancy office building where Convention of States is headquartered in Houston, Texas, not Austin, according to their website. Okay. Finally, uniting with the left and right, partnering for a con. Here is a man named Lawrence Lessig, very left-wing individual, often called the godfather of the Article 5 Convention movement. He's partnering in a debate, arguing for a convention with Mark Meckler. So here's your introduction.
Larry Lessig, thank you. Tell us please who your partner is in this debate.
So my partner is my friend and someone I've worked with for a long time, Mark Meckler.
Mark Meckler, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, there you go. And by the way, he wrote a book called Republic Lost in 2011 and then updated that a few years later. But there's a key thing that he put in page 293. It says, it's going to be much easier, Lessig says, to get a conversation about fundamental reform going in the context of a call for a convention. This is an important strategic opportunity that a call for a convention would offer. Different souls with different objectives could agree on the need for a convention without agreeing on the particular proposals that a convention should recommend. They also, in the interest of uniting the left and right, 1 or 2 times a year have gotten together groups from the left and from the right and libertarian leaning to strategize on how to trigger a convention, working together, right? Also of note is the Nation magazine that a few years ago, they put out an article that argued for a convention, that the progressive left should get on board with pushing for a convention. They quoted Mark Meckler in there, who said, the hordes have broken through the gates of Washington, and now we should tear the structure down. This was shortly before Donald Trump was inaugurated as president in January of 2017. Now, for a lot of conservatives, that language went over their head, tear the structure down, but it did not for the leftists. Sanford Levinson, an academic who is on the left side of things, and wrote a book about what he calls our undemocratic constitution. He argues that we should put the whole constitution up for a vote of the people, a national referendum, and if they vote it down, that we should reconsider the whole structure, meaning the Constitution. Now here's Mark Meckler talking about the structure. The resolution before you offers a structural solution to a structural problem by using your constitutional authority under Article 5. So this is just another way of saying the Constitution. The structure of our government is the Constitution, and that is, of course, what they propose to change through a convention process. Now, the Nation magazine full out came and said, we should push for a convention of states. A convention of states, therefore, is the best remaining option for sorely needed constitutional reforms. Now, mind you, this is a left-leaning, almost communist sympathizing magazine. So that's pretty significant. A lot of these people pushing for a convention, such as Mark Meckler, often give people the impression that nobody on the left is pushing for a convention. In fact, they oppose or they fear a convention. No, far from the case. All right. Now, if I haven't convinced you yet, maybe you're somewhat like this man from a video, like, all right. So if you're not convinced that there's some problems with the lobbying arm for pushing for a convention, maybe this isn't you can walk out now. I don't know. But if you are, then let's talk about solutions. Okay, Mark Meckler even agrees that we should enforce the Constitution.
Founders told us the Constitution itself was nothing more than a parchment barrier. It was going to take the will of the people to support the ideas in the Constitution. That's what it's going to take again.
Okay, so we need to push for the people to support the ideas of the Constitution, educate them, and they understand and demand that it be followed. Mark Meckler, hey, great idea. I wish I would have come up with that, right? All right. Well, it so happens that the John Birch Society has a program for doing that. We call it the Power of 500. Part of that involves states and local governments doing what we call nullification, as the founders called it. But in modern parlance, I might call it saying no to federal overreach as the founders intended, in the way that they intended. Of course, this is not sedition. This is not secession or anything like that. It's simply enforcing the Constitution that all state and local officials swear to uphold. Okay, but what to do first, I would say in Utah, is to ask your state legislators to oppose any new Article 5 convention applications and rescind any active applications. There are 2 in Utah. Okay, we need to introduce that, pass that. And I would encourage you to consider joining the John Birch Society today. Go to jbs.org/join. There's QR code if you want to scan that. Usually when people are here, I say, okay, I'll have a special offer for you. Talk with me afterwards about that. But I do have something for you as a kind of an incentive if you would like to, a special discount or special gift for you if you decide to join today. And I've got applications if you like paper. So with that, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to talking with you about preserving the Constitution, freedom under the Constitution. And thank you very much.